If you are anything like me, you have devoured the latest from Shonda Rhimes, which is Bridgerton's Queen Charlotte. It's a 6-part series on Netflix. It's incredible. And my eyes definitely got a little moist at the end. It's like really good. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the questions that have risen as a result of the show. What did King George suffer from? Was Queen Charlotte Black? Did Britain become a post-racialized world because of Queen Charlotte and King George? And before we get started, I think it's important to remind everyone that all we have to go off of when it comes to historical events are written documents and oil paintings. So it's difficult to know for sure. And these are topics that are still up for debate among historians. Kicking it off with King George. What did he suffer from? According to this article from the Tufts Medical Center, quote, modern medical interpretations of his condition suggest the king had porphyria, an abnormality of the blood that can lead to toxic effects on nerves and the brain, end quote. Others have argued that it was more psychiatric. Some have suggested bipolar disorder. There's this article from the BBC, which claims that a new research project at St. George's University of London has concluded that George III did actually suffer from mental illness. They use his letters as proof. According to this project, during episodes of illness, his sentences were way longer, like 400 words, 8 verbs long. One of the reasons porphyria had been suggested is because it can cause blue urine, which apparently King George had. But apparently, according to George's doctor's notes, the king was given medicine based on this plant that has deep blue flowers that can turn the urine blue. And I've officially talked more about urine than I ever wanted to on here. And then there's, what did King George III think about Black people? What was his participation or lack thereof in the slave trade? From the Guardian series, The Cost of the Crown. If you haven't read it, I recommend you do. They also have a podcast component, so if you're an audio learner, you can listen to it there. This is about the British kings and queens who supported and profited from slavery. Under King George III, it says, quote, an essay King George III wrote as a teenager arguing that slavery had no moral basis has been cited by some as evidence that the future king was opposed to it, but he supported the continuation of the slave trade and slavery and opposed the abolition movement behind the scenes, according to research by the historian Brooke Newman for her forthcoming book, The Queen's Silence. Is that hard and fast proof he wouldn't have married a Black woman or a mixed race woman? No. But it does poke holes in the King George that we are presented as one that is for the great experiment in bringing about racial equity that is shown in the show. Just to be clear, I don't think Shonda Rhimes and her team are under any obligation to present a historically accurate show. They take great pains at the beginning to say that this is fiction, loosely based on history. But I see the ways in which people treat fictional series like The Crown. And I worry about the level of media literacy. Again, not a Shonda Rhimes problem. But was Queen Charlotte Black? Let's discuss some of my findings. This is from The Guardian, The Great British Art Tour, a portrait of Britain's first Black queen. Quote, a theory first advanced by the Jamaican-born author J.A. Rogers in 1940 suggests that Queen Charlotte's distant ancestry through the Portuguese royal dynasty included Black Africans, end quote. When Horace Walpole, who was a member of the Whig Party, met Queen Charlotte, he said this, quote, the nostrils spreading too wide, the mouth has the same fault. But at the same time, he, quote, also stressed how pale she was, and his overall description was not unfriendly, end quote. But there's another thing to consider, and that's the eyes of the painter, because that's all we have to go off of. So this painting is by Alan Ramsey, but then look at this painting. Her lips are smaller, her nose is thinner, etc. She's definitely paler. Or this one. Pale, but with more pronounced lips and wider nostrils. Oil paintings are really hard to go off of, because Alan Ramsey was also an abolitionist. Did he paint her in such a way to promote the idea that she had Black ancestry? Again, we don't know for sure, but I wanted to show you different oil paintings just to show how much it can vary depending on the painter, who it's being painted for, etc. Here's another painting. And one could also say that perhaps she was lightened and her facial features were slimmed down as a way to hide her potential Black ancestry. And then there is the fact that she is described as Moorish. But in this Smithsonian Magazine article, Historian Lisa Hilton says that, quote, the term Moorish was used to refer to anyone who lived in the Moorish Empire, regardless of their race, end quote. But also the idea that even if Queen Charlotte had an African forebearer, it's so many generations removed that there wouldn't be any trace of it in her by the 18th century. I mean, we're talking allegedly the 13th century to the 18th century. So there's still debate on that. But let's get back to the show, Queen Charlotte. And for this, I want to pull up an article by a writer for Vox. This is a topic that I've struggled with, but I also don't know if it's my place to struggle with it, so I decided to seek out Black voices on the topic. This piece in Vox is from Nyla Burton. It's from May 5th, 2023. I think one of the refreshing things about the Bridgerton series, and again, I haven't watched seasons 1 and 2 in a while, is a way that there's just racial equity. If my memory is correct, I don't even recall during the first season the Duke's mixed heritage being a problem or something that was brought up a lot. And in general, I support colorblind casting. There's no reason why you can't have a period piece and have Black, white, Asian, etc. people playing the roles. I think the more opportunities that acting can give to marginalized people, the better. Because how many times over the decades, centuries, have marginalized people lost out on roles simply because they didn't look the part? But the thing with Queen Charlotte is race is very much a focal point of the series. The Great Experiment, as it is called. Nyla writes that, quote, the messages Queen Charlotte sends about the politics of wealth, interracial relationships, representational politics, and empire are dangerous. At the core of its danger is the choice to double down on the likely false idea that Queen Charlotte was Black, end quote. She then goes into this idea of shallow representation. And she gives the example of how are you supposed to feel good about the shallow representation of Lady Danbury, who spends the first 3 episodes being repeatedly raped by her husband. This is from April Morris, the editorial director of Off Color magazine. Quote, for some Black women, this all makes the series feel emotionally manipulative. Shonda is probably playing very heavily into the correlation between what's currently happening with Harry and Meghan Markle and what she would like us to envision was happening back then, even though it's not historical, end quote. Going on, quote, viewers may logically know that this scenario didn't occur, but it functions as a nod toward an incredibly deep-seated belief, one that says Britain and King George III ended slavery out of moral concerns and altruism, when really it was the resistance of slaves and colonized people that led to abolition and the withdrawal of British troops from the colonies, end quote. She goes on to say that reducing this rich and complicated history to interracial love saved the world, even for romance, feels cheap and intellectually bankrupt, end quote. It's a really interesting piece, and I think it's worth a read no matter where you fall on this issue. While I personally worry about the way people are going to take this as fact and run with it, I also don't know if it's Shonda Rhimes' responsibility to teach real history in a fictional show she made. But I'm also not going to speak for Black people. It's an interesting topic of conversation. Definitely read the article. It's worth it. Overall, I really enjoyed the series. 5 out of 5 Lindsay Buckinghams. If you follow my book reviews, you got that reference.